If you've got people taking care of your grave almost 200 years after your passing, you'd feel pretty fortunate. And James Wright, the man buried here, is one such fortunate man. Wright arrived in Sydney in January 1788 at the very beginnings of the British penal colony. He's what's known as a first fleeter, and there are more than 50 first fleeters buried in this cemetery. But there were first fleeters and there were first fleeters. Most of the people who arrived on those ships in January 1788 were convicts. And that includes James Wright. After being convicted of highway robbery in England in 1783, Wright was transported to Sydney in 1787. At the completion of his sentence in 1790, he was appointed government baker in Parramatta. And he prospered for decades as a free man before passing away in 1825. It's a classic Australian convict story of rehabilitation. St John's Cemetery in the heart of Parramatta in Sydney's west is the oldest and probably the most significant European burial ground on Australian soil. But it lies abandoned, unknown and unloved in one of Sydney's fastest growing commercial districts. A small group of dedicated locals work to keep the stories alive and the site maintained. But as Australian governments spend hundreds of millions on museums, memorials and heritage projects, this gem feels neglected. I grew up near here and I have at least one ancestor buried here, but I had no idea about St John's Cemetery until my brother told me about it around 10 years ago. It's a common problem. Most Sydneysiders don't recognise Parramatta's central role in the early colonial history of their city. I'm fascinated by the way we experience history as travellers. History is a pretty big part of what makes me travel. And you can go and visit some of the world's most stunning museums, something I love to do, or you can get out in places like this and they're both really important, but I've got to say I find the experience of visiting places like this very, very special. I've been here on many previous occasions and I have never ever seen another person in here, which is quite extraordinary. And on the one hand, that abandoned feel is great in that it gives the place a pretty special atmosphere, but it does feel a little bit like a piece of Australian history that probably deserves a bit more attention. Why are some museums, monuments and historical sites generously funded, while others, that still seem pretty important, are left like this? If you learned history at school in Australia in the 70s, you would have learned about the flogging parson. The Reverend Samuel Marsden was one of the most reviled figures in the teaching of the early colony during my childhood. Might have been because I went to a Catholic school. He's probably the best known figure in early colonial history to be buried here. Marsden is remembered most for his cruelty as a magistrate. The flogging parson nickname needs no explanation. He had a special loathing for Irish Catholics in the colony. He was the senior Church of England cleric in New South Wales for decades, preaching at nearby St John's Church in Parramatta until his death in 1838. Marsden might be the biggest name buried here, but this is the most important grave. So it's hard to believe that this is the oldest surviving European grave in Australia. And it's kind of amazing to consider that in January 1791, notable people in the colony gathered here to bid farewell to Henry Dodd. Dodd was no ordinary settler. He was the servant to Captain Arthur Phillip, and he was also a noted farmer, and he was responsible for growing some of the first early crops in the colony that really stabilised the food supply during very precarious times. This is the ancient signpost that directs visitors to Dodd's grave. It's illegible and almost invisible, but it's just a few hundred metres from Parramatta Station, Parramatta Westfield and Parramatta Stadium. Kind of weird thing that will strike you when you come into this cemetery is there's nothing really to indicate that it is a place of importance. So it has that deserted, abandoned feel. So this cemetery is home to some pretty important early penal colony history. But the state and neglect of the place might indicate otherwise. It feels a little bit like another Parramatta heritage tragedy, and there have already been quite a few of those. And there are more threatened.